Hi all, and welcome back. This is Blighted Ciphers, and I must first apologize for not properly introducing the project in the last video. For the first short story series on the channel, I'll be reading from a cosmic horror grimdark fantasy anthology I wrote to support the world building of my debut novel. This anthology is called Festered Gods, and the following story is the second entry, These Are Not Our Gods. This series will explore the creation of the universe and the cosmic battle in the background of my fantasy novel. These stories will all deal with gods/supernatural forces to one extent or another. The stories are not in chronological order, which is intentional so the lore is nuanced and will be at times contradictory. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. The sun is coming down, our god descends. Nakhmun peeked through the drawn curtains. In the streets, the frenzied crowd streamed down the road chanting their litany of doom. The people, elated with a joy Nakhmun had never seen, danced and celebrated a most mysterious event. Nakhmun used his hands to shade his eyes as he looked at the giant orb descending. Its progression was slow, and the orb was still high above. The warrior priest felt a tinge of euphoria swelling within him. Nakhmun closed the curtain in a hurried motion. "You hear them? Who are they to interpret the signs?" the high priest screamed. The priesthood stood in silence. Nakhmun, the lowest among them, took a few steps back to avoid the ire of the high priest. He glanced at the drawn curtains, unsure of what these heretical acts meant. "Madness! Complete corruption of soul and mind. Our prophecies are very clear. The astrologers are all in consensus." The high priest slumped in his chair. He slapped the scrolls strewn over his desk. "The sun is not to descend until the moon is swallowed by Hekatnet." The high priest rubbed his eyes, blurring his eyeliner to paint his sockets dark. Nakhmun placed a hand on his sword's hilt, drawing comfort from the leather strap. Outside, thousands of people gathered to meet the sun, or what they thought to be the sun. They chanted the same song and vibrated with ecstasy. Nakhmun wanted to shut their voices off from his head. Their cries reverberated from within the temple and echoed twice as loud within his skull. "What should we do, High Priest?" asked Imhotep. The High Priest stared blankly at his scrolls. He sat silently for a moment, then begrudgingly mumbled something too quiet for Nakhmun to hear. "If I may, High Priest, perhaps the Grand Vizier of thaumaturgy might have counsel for troubled minds." Imhotep spoke again. Nakhmun noticed the scribe spoke with the same caution as he used to address the pharaoh. The high priest sighed. "Nakhmun." "Your Eminence," Nakhmun replied, stepping forward and bowing his head low. "Take Imhotep, Onesh, and Amonis. Make sure they come back safe." Nakhmun shuddered. The chanting in the streets came back to the focus of his mind. His head still bowed, Nakhmun shut his eyes against his growing panic. The steel of his blade now felt cold, the memories of mass slaughter spasming his muscles in revulsion. "As you command, Your Eminence." Nakhmun led Imhotep and the two priests down the temple's halls. All around, hieroglyphs depicted the might of the pharaohs of old, of the conquest of their gods, of the forces that lurked in the dark and needed to be defeated. Nakhmun quickened his pace as they passed scenes from an all too recent history. Even by averting his eyes, he could not escape their grim vision. Lines upon lines of soldiers calling Nhmers, with the diligence of farmers reaping their harvest, under the approving eye of their pharaoh and the jackal. Both, king and god, towered over the height of the soldiers, dipping their feet in a pool of blood that rose to the waist of the soldiers. Nakhmun clenched his jaw, pushing the images from his mind. "These stories trouble you," Imhotep observed, his eyes glinting with surgical curiosity. Nakhmun shrugged. To you, they are stories. To me, they are memories. Nakhmun replied, carefully removing the venom from his words. The scribe closed his eyes as he nodded. Nakhmun motioned the contingent to stop. He peered into the streets from the temple's door. The crowd was streaming down towards the Jackal's temple, repeating their chant over and over. The sun is coming down! Our god descends! Nakhmun tried to focus on something other than their eerie chants. He watched them closely for a few breaths. His stomach churned as he took in the details of their state. Their dark skins were leathered, and their eyes were bleached. Tears ran down their cheek, a wasted effort to moisten their eyes. The crowd's face cracked under the weight of the sun, and some had their skin peeling off. They are looking at the sun, Nakhmun whispered to the group. Nakhmun felt Imhotep inching closer, so close he could hear the scribe's breathing. There appears to be a connection between the sun and their condition, Imhotep spoke, as if observing the entrails of a gutted animal. Indeed, the sun appears to be the culprit. Best avoid its gaze. Nakhmun looked at the crowd again. They all looked gleefully at the sun as its light punished their devotion. Don't look at the sun. Got it. Nakhmun took a few steps forward before Imhotep's hand grabbed his shoulder and pulled him back. You misheard me, warrior. Best avoid the sun's gaze. Imhotep then pointed up. Nakhmun looked at the ceiling, then at the floor. Shade. Shade was the word to the sun's spell. Within an instant, Nakhmun shouted at temple servants to fetch them turbans, cloaks, and straw hats. Bundled like mummies, Nakhmun led them through the narrow streets towards the library. They treated the entranced mob like a river. They walked diagonally, flowing down its current. Then, when they found narrow streets that were not crowded, they navigated them until they reached their destination. The library was deserted. Giant columns of stone rose from the ground, shelving hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Desks the size of ants in comparison to the bookshelves held notes and scrolls. Seats were laid on their back as if the scribes got up in a hurry to flee. The sun is coming down, our god descends. A solitary voice broke from the droning chants of the outside mob. Nakhmun signaled the others to stay quiet and stay where they were. He silently drew his sword and walked on the tip of his toes towards the chanting voice. He walked the length of a bookshelf, listening to the voice. It came from around the row of scrolls behind the desk with a fallen chair. Nakhmun threw the table away, ready to fend his enemy. Instead, he found a crippled man with his legs cut above the knee and too heavy to crawl, twitching on the floor, repeating the same chant. The sun is coming down. Our god descends. Nakhmun relaxed. This man could hurt no one. Yet, the warrior did not want to chance a surprise attack. Rest now, my brother. Nakhmun swiftly plunged his blade into the man's eye socket. He drew his blade back and cleaned it against his robe. The window in front of the dead man was broken, and where the man's chair was sprawled, a thick ray of sunlight covered its surface. Nakhmun let Imhotep take the lead. While the scribe navigated the endless shelves of books, rows of desks, and unending stacks of papyrus, Nakhmun kept watch for potential threats. They took a staircase leading underground. At this level, the only light present came from oil lamps. The priests took off their turbans, complaining about not being able to breathe properly. Nakhmun could not stop them, but he chose to keep his. Below the library's bookshelves gave way to smooth walls. Nakhmun brushed his hand against the wall surface in wonder. It is said that below was once the largest obsidian stone known to man. Imhotep spoke, breaking a silence that settled unnoticed. Our masons worked into its chambers under the guidance of the fourth Grand Vizier of thaumaturgy. Imhotep continued. Walls are guardians against the sins of time. They protect us from what is without, yet hold us captive within. Nakhmun felt a cold shiver as he suddenly felt watched. The abyssal darkness of the walls eagerly drank the dim light cast by the oil lamps. Master Scribe, Olnesh spoke. In your metaphor, what do these walls, these guardians, withhold from us then? Nakhmun leaned in closer, to not miss any words exchanged. They withhold freedom, my dear comrades. They withhold freedom from escaping ourselves, and freedom from fighting ourselves. The priest mumbled their appreciation of the answer. Nakhmun cursed himself for being slower. He did not understand. In layman's terms, what do you mean? Nakhmun asked, his cheeks flushing with shame. The Grand Vizier of thaumaturgy who first conceived this labyrinth of wisdom intended to create a prison for the inquiring mind. In his devious scheme, scribes who worked in this dungeon had no distraction from the work before them. If they looked up, all they could see was the endless abyss that is the blackness of these walls. Yet, should they choose to disregard their study and gaze into this void, their mind would inevitably self-cannibalize and torment the scribes with introspection and guilt. The only way to escape the sustained mental flagellation is to look beyond the walls. Nakhmun took uncertain steps, feeling as if the walls were closing in on him. Beyond the walls is acceptance. In recognizing one's place in the world and one's contribution to the world, one can finally devote themselves to the true purpose of thaumaturgy. But such is the gift of only one god, the hidden god. Imhotep stopped. Shkharzi maz kharzami. Unveil my eyes and reveal your truth. Imhotep's voice dropped. A gust of hot air blew past Nakhmun, snuffing all the oil lamps in a blink. A heavy thud echoed, and the slow creaking of a heavy stone broke the silence. From behind a well-lit room came into view. Nakhmun first saw more shelves, though less extravagant, holding more scrolls, statues, and objects he could not recognize. The door was sliding slowly to the left, revealing the room behind piece by piece. There was a desk, rich rugs, incense burning, and the golden cast of a cat. Nakhmun shivered when the door opened, exposing the blood writing on the wall. These are not our gods. The priest exclaimed in shock. Imhotep stood still, with what Nakhmun guessed to be disbelief. The warrior priest stepped in front of the group and was first to enter the room. Writings in a foreign language lined the walls from floor to ceiling, depicting geometric shapes and icons Nakhmun faintly recognized. He was sure he knew this language, but his mind did not let him remember. He cautiously checked the room. The table disappeared under piles of scrolls, papyrus, ancient texts, and disorganized notes. Nakhmun read the word Nasumba before moving on. He checked behind the curtains, behind the shelves, and inspected the ceiling, but no sign of danger. Nakhmun relaxed a little and lowered his blade. The priest and scribes were still in shock. It's all good, he said to them. His voice broke their daze, and Imhotep was first to gather his thoughts. Almost in sync, the scribes pored over the written material. The scribes and priests spent hours in the study. They hurriedly paced the room, fetching all forms of text to compare them and scribble notes on blank papyrus Nakhmun found in an adjacent room. They carried on for what seemed like hours in utter and complete silence. Their devotion and diligence reminded Nakhmun why he chose the martial specialization as a priest. Nakhmun gave a shy cough, hoping to break the silence. Who is Nasumba? Nakhmun asked at last, irritated by the silence, interrupted only by the priest's breathing. Esoteric tales. Amun is dismissed, reprimanding Nakhmun with a look. Nakhmun held the priest's gaze unbothered. As far as rank and title went, they were equals. Indulge me, Nakhmun said, feigning the air of erudition the priest so carefully maintained. Imhotep sighed and adjusted the folds of his robe under his arm for more movement reach. The scribe never took his eyes off his work, never stopped jotting notes while he delivered the story. Hermetic esotericism proposes a strange occurrence that redefines the divine landscape. A scourge of sorts that plagued the gods, invited into this reality by none other than the infamous King Nasumba. Nakhmun nodded. He would not let them know that half of that vocabulary was lost on a man whose devotion was to the god of culling, to the jackal. A profound tale with cautions against the seeking of the unknown, whilst promising rewards as troubling as they are fruitful. What did Nasumba want, and what did he get in return? Nakhmun asked. King Nasumba, corrected Amonis, is the father of thaumaturgy. He sought to defeat sleep, and in doing so swore allegiance to entities foreign to our cosmos. These entities, the tale goes, corrupted and feasted on our gods. All this eons ago, Anish added. Nakhmun glanced at the priest who spoke with what bordered reverence. But it is a tale and nothing more. Imhotep brushed the air as if closing the matter. What's he got to do with the writing on the wall? Nakhmun asked. Imhotep looked at the warrior, and Nakhmun suppressed his urge to smile when he saw the irritation in the scribe's eyes. If we knew, we would have left already. The scribe loudly dropped a stack of parchment over his desk. In unison, scribe and priest returned to their task in silence, their breathing the only interruption. Nakhmun explored the rooms around the study. He came to find this chamber to be the private study of the Grand Vizier. The man must have lost his mind by Nakhmun's estimation. The obsessive writing on the walls, tales of the origin of forbidden knowledge, all this seemed too much for a sane man. Nakhmun suspected another alternative for this occult practice. The Dark Wall's intent was to drive its prisoners into madness. Before exploring the library, Nakhmun let the priest know he would be within shouting distance. They grumbled, all too happy to see him leave. The feeling was mutual. Nakhmun grabbed a torch and ventured down the halls. All was quiet. Nakhmun felt self-aware of his breathing and his footsteps. He became agitated by the inescapable darkness. The torch barely lit the path in front of him, and even the oil lamps lining the walls barely broke the darkness. His bored and uneasy mind started to wander, and soon opened the memories he tried to suppress. Nakhmun sat at the foot of the wall. It was cold. He closed his eyes for a moment. Images of the slaughter of Nhmers replayed before him. He was standing in the streets of Nuriyat, blood streaming down the streets as soldiers and warrior priests fell upon the fleeing nomads. Nhmers' cot begged for mercy, and more promised the world in exchange for their lives. Nakhmun fought back his tears. He saw himself, grabbing a man by the back of his head, his sword ready to strike. The fury, the hatred Nakhmun saw in his own eyes was so foreign. They glinted like a jackal's eyes reflecting firelight. His mind was self-cannibalizing, Nakhmun realized. Rushed steps echoed loudly in the corridor. Nakhmun sprung to his feet, dropped his torch, and drew his blade. He heard giggles sounding like those of a child. "Who goes there?" Nakhmun shouted. His voice echoed back to him. The giggles came again and disappeared around the corner. "It's not safe out there. Come back!" Nakhmun yelled. No response came, but the steps hurried away from him. Nakhmun ran after the child. He swiftly caught up to the child running down the hall and grabbed the boy by the wrist. "Stop!" Nakhmun commanded. The boy turned, frightened. Nakhmun let go of the boy's arm as soon as he saw his face. It was Sanib, his childhood and Nhmer friend. Nakhmun blinked in disbelief and the boy disappeared. More hurried steps came from behind Nakhmun. Imhotep, out of breath, put a hand on Nakhmun's shoulder. Are you alright? We heard your shouts. Imhotep left his sentence unfinished. Nakhmun was standing in a room large as a royal hall. The walls rose like pyramids to meet at the top center, closing in on a large floor of onyx. Small walls with burning oil illuminated the room, and at its center, carved from stone, stood the giant scepter. Grand Vizier! Imhotep shouted and rushed towards the prostrated man. The Grand Vizier turned to see the group, and Nakhmun gasped at the man's gouged eyes. You must not look at the sun, the sorcerer whispered before laughing maniacally. You must not let the sun see you. Nakhmun rushed to Imhotep's aid, helping the Grand Vizier to his feet. The priests were in tow, cutting rags from their robes to clean the sorcerer's wound. The Vizier grabbed at Nakhmun's sleeves with an iron-tight grip. He pulled the warrior priest close. Did the sun see you? Did it? The Grand Vizier's words were urgent. Yes, Nakhmun answered, unsure what to do. The Grand Vizier let go of Nakhmun and slumped back. Then we are finished, the Grand Vizier whispered. The old man broke into soft cries, mumbling to himself, and likely to his god. Oh, Sun God, forgive us. Forgive our trespasses. His breathing was strained, his words barely audible. We followed Nasumba's steps and reached out to foreign gods. What we discovered? Nakhmun heard breaking of glass and shuffling of feet racing down the halls. Soon the mob's roars became clear. The sun is coming down. Our god descends. Nakhmun let go of the Grand Vizier and stood with his blade drawn. The fanatics came running towards the scepter. Nakhmun slashed down the first three to reach them. He yelled at the others to run the opposite way. This way! Follow me! Imhotep urged the group. The scribe led them across the room and off to a hall off to the right. Nakhmun turned just in time to see a group of 5 fanatics, bleached eyes and burned skins, prompting the Grand Vizier to his feet. They inspected him, and upon finding his eyes sockets empty, they became angry and tore at the man. Nakhmun was panting, but the others were out of breath when they finally reached the servants' entrance to the library. The entrance opened to a narrow alleyway. Nakhmun quickly got his bearing and took the others through its winding turns. The priests were shaken, and Imhotep visibly shocked. The droning of the fanatics was a ways off, and Nakhmun assumed they were safe. The roads leading to the library were far from those that led to the Jackal's temple. They walked for a long time, Nakhmun trying to remember every alleyway that would lead back to the sun's temple. They stayed off the main roads, and occasionally spotted groups of entranced fanatics. Nakhmun made quick work of them, leaving their blistered bodies bleeding on the dirt. The sun's temple came into view, its pyramids rising high into the sky. Yet far behind them, on a distant hill, rose the Jackal's temple, a pyramid of similar architecture. There, the sun's slow descent aggregated the entranced mass. Nakhmun leaned against the wall and carefully spied around the corner. The street was empty, and a quick dash would bring them to the temple's entrance. The priest turned to give the group their orders, when from the roof of the homes jumped the bodies of fanatics. Nakhmun kicked the first one, sliced the second, and ready to attack the third when he saw 2 more fanatics appear. They grabbed Amonis and dragged him towards the street. The priest cried and pleaded for help when one of the fanatics pulled the priest's head back and forced his eyes open. Amonis' eyes bleached within moments, and he smiled with the same ecstasy as the others. Now 3, the fanatics ran back towards Nakhmun. Run! Nakhmun shouted at Imhotep and Onesh. He lunged at 2 of the fanatics, hacking their hands as they reached for his. Imhotep was at the temple's footstep, Onesh a heartbeat behind. Nakhmun finished off his 2 attackers and ran to join them. The entranced Amonis grabbed Onesh by the collar and jolted him back. Onesh fell on his back, and Amonis instantly forced the priest to look at the sun. Nakhmun was now on top of the 2 priests, both staring at him with bleached eyes. Rest now, my brothers. Nakhmun cleanly split their heads from their bodies then locked the temple's gate behind him. Nakhmun was soaked in blood. Imhotep was quiet and dejectedly walking. Nakhmun said nothing. He had nothing to say. He could not promise things would be alright. He could not promise the priests were in a better place. All he could do was walk with the scribe as they headed back to the high priest's office. His Eminence stood with his back to the door. Nakhmun instantly noticed the bloodied hands of the high priest. The man was facing out towards the window, curtains drawn wide. Nakhmun reached for his blade, ready to strike down the high priest the moment he sang praises to the sun. "I sought an audience with the sun god," the high priest said, his back to Nakhmun and Imhotep. Guess what he said? The high priest let out a short and sour laugh. Nothing. He said nothing. Why? The high priest shook his slumped head. Because he is dead. All our gods are dead. He then pointed at the descending sun. And these are not our gods. Nakhmun's heart sank. He guessed as much, but the confirmation shattered his resolve. What do we do now? Nakhmun asked. It was Imhotep who answered, a soft whisper that sounded far away. Acceptance. The high priest turned to face Nakhmun and the scribe. He was smiling, but his eyes were gouged out. It was then that Nakhmun saw them discarded on the floor. No eyes can see behind the curtains drawn by the gods, the high priest said with a maddened smile. For truth is the domain of the hidden god. What do we do now? We join them. He spread his arms and jumped out of the window. The glass broke, flooding the room with light. Before Nakhmun heard the thud of the high priest's body hitting the floor, the sun's light hit Imhotep's uncovered face. Nakhmun tried to jump in front of the scribe to shield him from the light, but Imhotep's eyes were already bleached. The scribe smiled ecstatically and ran down the hall towards the streets. Nakhmun needed to save the scribe or do whatever he could. They ran down the halls, past the walls of hieroglyphics, and within moments Imhotep threw himself at the forming mob outside the temple. Nakhmun slashed and hacked at the fanatics as he tried to reach the scribe. The chanting was deafening, the bodies packed tight, and before he knew it, all went black. His heart ran like a cheetah, making the warrior priest feel like a heart attack could strike at any moment. Exhausted and out of breath, he shoved and punched his way out of the mob. Look at the sun, grandfather. Look how beautiful and elegant. Oh, how the sun god blesses us. A hand grabbed Nakhmun's shoulder. Nakhmun swiftly twisted and broke the wrist, forcing the hand to release him. He did not look up. He refused to look at the sun. He looked at the faces of the crowd, hollow white eyes and blistered skins. Look at the... Nakhmun ran for the first alley he saw. From its safety, he slumped against the wall. The crowd grew, with now leaving their homes to join it. Nakhmun felt cold sweat sticking his linen tunic to his back. His tantalizing fear threatened to paralyze him. He took a couple of breaths in and tried to think of his options. There were none. He had to flee the city. Hey! The quiet voice was almost drowned by the chanting crowd. Nakhmun jumped, searching for the voice. Your eyes. They are clear, the soft voice said. Nakhmun searched with his eyes where the voice could be coming from. He said nothing. Can you hear me, grandfather? Nakhmun's throat was dry when he tried to speak. Where are you, hidden voice? Nakhmun searched the alley. Mud brick walls flanked him on both sides, with cloth hanging from ropes connecting both buildings. The mud brick houses did not have windows facing the alley, but one of them had a door that was slightly cracked. Nakhmun tried to peer inside. The house was dark as night. A pair of flashing eyes stared at him. "I have a blade," the voice whispered harshly. "As you should," Nakhmun said. He glanced at the fanatic mob streaming down the streets. He did not understand why they stopped hunting him. The man with broken legs was crawling in the same direction as the crowd. His eyes were bleached white, his face with withered leather, with oozing sores. The man tried to drag himself with his arms, but the entranced crowd walked over him. He pushed on, smiling and crying, chanting the same chant. Nakhmun wanted to look away, but the sight itself was entrancing. The crowd stepped over the man, over and over, until his head, then his ribcage, broke. A slow and crushing death followed, as the crowd continued to stream, oblivious to anything. Nakhmun felt a tear run down his cheek. "Rest now, brother," he whispered. A gentle hand cupped the back of his head, and he jerked up. It was the young boy from the door. "Don't be afraid, grandfather. We will figure it out." The boy held a hand out to help Nakhmun up. Distraught and confused, Nakhmun took the hand. He followed the boy through the cracked door. Inside the house was dark, but the boy easily led Nakhmun through several rooms. "Where are we?" Nakhmun asked. His mind felt heavy, his memories blurred. "The Old Granaries," the boy answered. Nakhmun nodded, then realized the boy would not be able to see him. "I see. My aunts are now old, but they remember when their mothers used these tunnels to hide from the soldiers. My aunts say this tunnel were built by our clan to hide the children and our belongings." Nakhmun was hit by a wave of shame. Suddenly his memories came into sharp focus. Imhotep, Onesh, Amonis, High Priest and Grand Viziers, descending suns and pandemonium, all triggered by the memory of the Old Granaries. This was where Nakhmun and other soldiers finished off the last survivors of the Nhmers clans. Nakhmun sighed. He realized how exhausted he was. His frail mental threatened to collapse under memories of his past, but he shoved them down and said nothing. The boy led Nakhmun through several turns. They could hear the rumbling of feet on the streets above. The sound came fainter as they continued to walk, in the air dry and cold. Nakhmun could tell they were moving deeper beneath the city. His mind, now clear, and revisiting the recent death, agitated Nakhmun. He did not want any more silence. "Why did you save me?" The boy walked without a word for a moment. "I know who you are." Nakhmun let go of the boy's hands and drew his blade, only to realize he had no weapon. Disarmed and blind, he knew it would be a quick death. "My aunts told me, from a young age, how to recognize the old guard." Nakhmun's throat choked. He wanted to survive. He raised his hands defensively. "It was a long time ago. I have changed since," Nakhmun cried. "I never agreed to it. They told us you were scheming sorcerers, serving foreign gods, and plotting to destroy us." Above, the rumbling of the crowd created an ongoing buzz within the walls of the tunnels. I did horrible things." Nakhmun's memory of the fury and hatred formed a clear image in his mind. His tears burned hot against his cheeks. "And I have paid for my sins. The gods know I have paid for them." For the first time, Nakhmun accepted that everyone he knew or cared for was a victim under the sun's spell. "Please, forgive me," Nakhmun begged. The boy was silent. Nakhmun waited for the familiar burn of a dagger stab, but nothing came. The tunnel was silent save for the rumbling above. Nakhmun's tears turned into anger. "Forgive me! "Forgive me!" he cried, and the dark tunnel echoed it right back at him. The echo doubled and overlapped. The echoes grew, and soon the voices amplified into sounding like a mob. "Forgive me! Forgive me!" the voices echoed. Nakhmun felt their anger, their hatred, their malice. The voices rang in his ears, mocking his despair. In the darkness, the voices sounded like they came from everyone at once. Nakhmun shook with fear. "Forgive me!" A solitary voice screamed in his ear. Nakhmun turned to face the voice, but another yelled in his other ear, "Forgive me!" Nakhmun felt the cold, dry air tickle his ears as the voices shouted. The ghastly mimicking was thick with hatred and rage. The voices danced, amplified, and tormented Nakhmun. The warrior priest broke into a run. He did not know where to, but he ran. His feet's echoes were immediately drowned by the voices. "Forgive me! Forgive me!" they parroted in sinister mockery. Nakhmun ran with his hands stretched out. He felt a wall turn and followed it. The voices chased him, always feeling like only 2 steps behind. "Forgive me! Forgive me!" The voices were no longer his. They were young, they were old. They were male and female. They were angry, they were desperate. "Forgive me! Forgive me!" They hounded him and pushed his mind to the brink of madness. He was in the deepest darkness, cold and alone. The only voice he heard were the unmistakable voices he wished to forget. The voices of the countless he'd killed. And then Nakhmun stopped running. "Hidden God," he whispered, his fear and despair fading into resignation. Soft feet paced around him. A hand, cold, reached out and clasped his. "Forgive me." The voice was soft, cold, and unfamiliar. It was eerie and disembodied, but Nakhmun found peace in accepting its otherness. Nakhmun dried his tears and followed the boy. His mind at peace, his sanity returned. Nakhmun wanted to speak to the hidden god. He walked through the end of the tunnel and stepped into a room with tall stone statues of face masks. The warrior priest noticed that the hidden god was gone. Around the room, statues of 1,000 faces looked up towards the sky. Behind them, carved in the blackest of stones, lurked a shapeless form with outstretched fingers. Each finger dug into the back of the head of the masquerades. The sight was deeply disturbing. The masquerades were twisted in a vision of agony and dread, guarding a giant doorway. He heard them before he saw them. Men of the desert, hooded in black turbans, swiftly grabbed Nakhmun from behind and forced him to his feet. "Who are you, old man?" the first man asked. Nakhmun was confused and scared. Just an instant ago, the room was empty. A soft wind gathered the dust, and as the sand blew away, an elderly matron appeared. "Leave him. This one was summoned by the hidden god." The matron was covered in black shawl, bent over the weight of her age. On his feet, Nakhmun recognized the company to be Nhmers clansmen. "It is all right, you can dispel the veil," the matron said. Another, stronger wind picked up and covered the hall with sand. For a breath, Nakhmun felt within the eye of a sandstorm. As fast as it came, the wind blew, revealing a group of 100 or so Nhmers standing to an ailing giant. Nakhmun was staring at a fallen god. The giant body of the hidden god was covered in protruding cocoons, the size of a human head. The god's body was pale and emaciated. His stomach was bloated, and within glowed an amber light that revealed the god's blood vessels. A sinister creature swam inside the god's abdomen. The Nhmers diligently cut off the cocoons and threw them on a pyre that burned in a black flame. The fire scantily masked the horrid smell of decay. "He is dying," the matron said. "A scourge is killing the gods." Nakhmun was at a loss of words. The matron not once looked at him in the face. Nakhmun felt a crushing shame for his part in the calling. He wanted to drop to his knees and beg for their forgiveness, but forgiveness could not bring back the dead. "We came to warn your people, for we have seen it done to ours." The matron's voice held back tears. Nakhmun cast down his eyes. Before we were nomads, we too built tall houses, grand palaces, and great cities to house our gods. But one by one, they fell ill. They warred and accused each other of causing the scourge. In the end, they all succumbed to the same fate. Nakhmun thought about the tale of Nasumba and all the horror he'd witnessed in just a day. They fell from the sky, rose from the earth, or the waters spat them out. Those who were dead were eaten from within. The matron pointed to the laying body of the hidden god. Those on their way to die were covered in cocoons and bloated like a corpse. The last god to fall was Nhmers, god of wisdom. He set her people to travel the plains and warned others that something vile was coming for them. Why can the gods fight it? Nakhmun asked, shaken. Only the gods know, the matron said, a sad hint of sarcasm in her tone. But your hidden god listened. They built these tunnels for us, allowed us to live in their temple, and in exchange, asked us to nurse them in their dying days. They knew death would find them too. Nakhmun let the weight of her words hang in silence. This prophecy meant to save this world was what doomed it. He clenched his jaws before speaking. I thought the jackal saw to the extermination of your kind. And you did, the matron said, revealing for the first time her face. Beneath her shawl, a lipless face twisted into a smile. But the hidden god conceals. They hid our souls deep underground so we could journey together. We served them as wraith, holding the last memories of what preys on the gods. Enough, Shiloh. The voice of the hidden god rumbled, making Nakhmun feel like his soul shook within his skull. You are the last hope of the gods, Nakhmun. I chose you, for you have seen how fear can drive a god to madness. What eats me from within has no interest in your kind. You are our only salvation. Nakhmun shivered. He was a priest and he was a warrior. When duty called, he must answer. How? You, like I, are already dead. You saw your own body trampled before your eyes. Before you sojourned across the desert of eternity, I called you here, in this plain. Nakhmun stumbled, the terrible feeling of realizing his death sinking in. You must warn the others, or this world will not stand. I can hide you by giving you a piece of my essence, but should you accept, your fate will be the same as mine. All around Nakhmun, the Nhmers had stopped tending to the withering god. They bid their farewells to one another, undead souls uncertain of what awaited them once they passed with the god they nursed. The matron watched Nakhmun expectantly. Nakhmun looked at the faces of the Nhmers staring back at him. Without a doubt, Nakhmun had ended the lives of some of them. A lifetime serving the jackal god had only earned him a place in hell. The hidden god offered a chance at redemption, if not before the gods, at least before the Nhmers. I will do it. The hidden god opened his mouth and exhaled. A wind blew, spreading the scattered souls of the Nhmers into grains of sand. As the hidden god exhaled, his body caved in. His skin dried, his flesh disappeared, and his corpse was a husk. The cocoons turned gray and calcified. The specimen in the god's abdomen twitched violently and died, taking with it the ember glow. The hidden god was dead. Nakhmun felt the god's essence latched to his. He drowned in the essence of the hidden god. He gulped for air, but none came to him. Crushed under the weight of the god, his soul carried the weight of his calling. Then, when Nakhmun thought his soul would crumble, a soft wind blew and carried him away. Standing in the castle's court, Nakhmun was one of many souls passing through. The souls were distraught, shaking their heads to and fro with horrifying speed. Nakhmun saw giant monstrosities flanking the journeying souls, greedily picking at them to feast. The power of the hidden god veiled Nakhmun. The warrior priest passed through the castle, noticing the resemblance of these monstrosities to deities of his world. They wore masquerades that poorly mimicked the true gods, yet the uncanny resemblance left a haunting feeling as alienating as it was familiar. Nakhmun crossed the dreamscape and stood before the world of mortals. As he looked back to the gods, he saw the sun god from this world. The deity's hog face had human eyes with a beak twisted into a frown. These creatures were alien to his world. These were not his gods.